Hi, this is Pastor Barry with a brief supplement video for study number 7, God's Guidance and Common Sense. There is no manuscript study for this particular lesson, but because discipleship groups are really choosing between lesson 7 and lesson 8. And so I chose the uh, inductive manuscript to go with lesson 8. But if you're reading this individually and you're doing lesson 7, I wanted to make sure that you had a little bit of background and highlighting on this particular lesson. If you read the introduction to this study, part of what the authors are making clear is that it is possible as Christians to put too much emphasis on the supernatural workings of God and to ignore the more ordinary ways in which God works. And so they're not trying to say that God doesn't work in extraordinary ways. They're only saying, let's not overlook the ways that God works through our intellect and through common sense. And so if you look at that first study in 1 Corinthians 16, it's fairly mundane for a Bible study. There's just not a lot here that's extraordinary. They are trying to help us to see that Paul, an apostle and a man who received a great number of extraordinary spiritual revelations directly from God, also uses his mind. He thinks through things strategically. He makes decisions based on uh, his desires and what opportunities are available to him. He plans and organizes things in a way that they seem likely to work. And so that's part of what we see in 1 Corinthians 16. I will say, or just add to that, that Paul, in addition to using all the faculties that God has given to him, always holds these things with an open hand. He always allows God to do something that one wouldn't expect. And so I think it's a good lesson for us as well that we should not ignore what God has given to us in the way of common sense, in the way of intellectual capacity, the ability to plan and organize. All of those things are a gift of God and can be ways that God uses us and directs us. But we hold them with an open hand. We allow God to be God and to override some of the way that we would normally think or some of the ways that we would normally act in favor of being led in a different kind of direction by his Spirit. Similarly, in Daniel 1, which if you were going to do an inductive study for this lesson, I would recommend Daniel 1, 1 through 17. I think that is the better of the two passages to do a study on. Just because it's a narrative, there's a little bit more to get into in terms of the story there. A little bit of background on that story is that the people of Israel had been exiled to Babylon, and so at that time, one of the things that happens is they end up taking some of the best and brightest of the Jews to Babylon to be educated in the ways of the Babylonians. And so Daniel is one of those. He's of noble or royal heritage, and he and his friends are chosen in part because they're smart, because they're already learned, because they seem to have a lot of potential. And it's those characteristics that God draws on for later assignments that he has for Daniel and his friends. There's nothing wrong with those things. There's nothing wrong with being bright, being well educated, being from a noble background. God can use any of that stuff. And we see the different ways that God works in this Daniel passage. Again, Daniel's a person who has extraordinary kinds of guidance and miracles that happen in his life. But here in Daniel 1, everything seems fairly ordinary. You know, when he wants to try a vegetarian diet, not because he's a vegetarian, but because as a Jew, he can't eat this meat that's been sacrificed to pagan gods. And so he prefers just to go vegetarian. It's the one way to know that he's not eating meat sacrificed to idols. He does not get a miracle that allows him to do that in some kind of extraordinary way. There's no appearance of God or an angel that tells the guy in charge what to do. Rather, Daniel comes up with a sensible plan. How about you let us try it for 10 days and just see how we look? And that seems reasonable to the guy. And so he allows Daniel and his friends to try this different kind of diet, and it works out. And so it's kind of by observation that the miracle, I guess, is that Daniel and his friends look as good as all the rest of the guys who are eating the meat. So how can this study work for you or for your group? I think the key here is to be as honest as you can and as specific as you can when you're talking about your own life, about your own past training and present opportunities, about your special interests and areas of expertise, and about other kinds of knowledge that you have, logic, finance, um, business experience, that can be applied to your spiritual life. I also think if you're in a group that it can be really helpful to have other people in your group comment on the things that you're sharing, about whether they see those things as gifts or not. Because sometimes we fool ourselves. We think that we're gifted at something, and honestly, we're not that gifted. Or we can do the reverse. We can be very gifted at something, but think of ourselves as kind of ordinary. And that seems humble, but the problem with it, and by the way, I don't think it's humble. Humble is not thinking low of yourself. Humble is knowing who you really are before God and before other people. Um, but when we think too lowly of ourselves, when we run down our own gifts and resources, then we tend not to employ them in God's service. If I don't know that I'm a gifted worship leader, if I don't know that I'm a gifted teacher, or that I have potential in those areas that could be developed, then I never develop it because I feel like uh, either I can't do it at all, or that I'm so ordinary at it that it wouldn't be worth the effort to try to develop. And that's where having other people in your group, or if you're studying on your own, just to talk to a few people, to check your perceptions with them, can really be valuable. All of us have blind spots. That is not a sin. But what can be a sin is that we live with only our own opinion of ourselves rather than allowing God to say who we really are. And one of the ways God does that is by using our friends and family to fill in some of those blank spots. Well, that's all I have for you in this particular video. Next week, uh, well, if you're studying on your own, next week is study lesson 8. Um, but it's possible that if your group is studying lesson 7 this week, that you'll be doing your missional activity next week. The missional activity, I'm looking at a calendar, is the week of October the 21st. So on the week of October the 21st, you should be doing your missional activity. The week of October 14th is either this lesson or lesson 8. Well, God bless you, and I hope that God is really speaking to you, not just through the guide, but through his word and through your brothers and sisters.